I have been a man of tools my whole life. A hammer tells you what it means. A chisel does not lie. A nail goes where you drive it or it bends, and either way you know where you stand. Words were never so reliable, and I learned young not to lean on them. So when I walked into the land office in Breakyard on a Tuesday morning in April of 1882 and wrote out the notice that would change my life, I kept it to 12 words. Homesteader seeks wife. Paper arrangement. Shared labor. No obligations beyond the claim. Duff Jessamine, the land clerk, read it over his spectacles and set it on the board between a cattle sale handbill and a reward notice for a stolen bay mare. He did not ask questions. Duff had known me 3 years and had learned that questions were a currency I did not trade in. I had my reasons, and they were simple. The claim was a quarter section on the Sage Flat, 160 acres of open grass with a cottonwood creek running the south boundary, and a soddy I had been turning, wall by wall, into a frame house. I had lived on it alone since my wife Alma died of the fever in the winter of '79. I had improved it, fenced it, broken sod, planted winter wheat, built a forage shed where I shod horses for the cattle outfits that trailed through Breakyard twice a year. By the law, I had 14 months left to prove up. But the proving required more than I had done, and the territorial register had made it clear in his last visit that a man living alone on a quarter section with no family and no crop record beyond one failed wheat field was not the kind of settler the government meant to reward. I needed a wife on the paper. I did not need a wife in the way a man needs a wife. That distinction mattered to me then, and I wrote the notice the way I would write an order for nails, clear, specific, without sentiment. She arrived 19 days later on the Thursday stage. I was shoeing a dun gelding for Cleve Otten's outfit when the coach pulled into Breakyard, and I did not look up. I heard the door bang and the driver call down a trunk, and then Duff came across the street with his spectacles pushed up into his hair and told me a woman had come about my posting. "She's in the office," he said. "She has a trunk and a carpet bag, and she asked to see the homesteader." I did not know what to tell her. "Tell her I'll be along when I finish this hoof." Duff gave me a look. "She's been on a stage for 4 days, Judson. She's got dust in her teeth and she hasn't complained once. That's worth hurrying for." I set the gelding's hoof down and wiped my hands on my apron and walked across the street. She was standing by the window in the land office with her back to the door, reading the posted notices on the far wall. She was not tall. Her dress was dark blue, road-worn but well-made, and her hair was pinned up in a way that had survived 4 days on a stage and still looked deliberate. She had a carpet bag at her feet and a trunk by the door, and she was reading Duff's rainfall chart with what appeared to be genuine interest. "I'm Harlow," I said. She turned. She had a thin face, sharp at the jaw, with brown eyes that looked at me the way a good horse looks at a new fence, measuring it, deciding whether to trust it or go around. "Nessa Pardo," she said, "I've come about your notice." "I see that. You wrote 12 words. I'd like more than 12 before I decide." I had not expected that. I do not know what I had expected. Something softer, something uncertain. She stood with her hands clasped in front of her and waited for me to speak, and I realized that she was not nervous. She was evaluating. "The claim is on the Sage Flat," I said. 160 acres, Cottonwood Creek on the south line. I've got a house half built, a forge, a corral, and a wheat field that failed last year. I need a wife on the record to prove the claim. I am not asking for anything else. Separate quarters. I'll finish the second room this week. And when the claim is proved, you'll have a share of the land. We can draw that up with Duff." She looked at me for a long moment. I do not know what she saw, a tall man in a leather apron with forge soot on his forearms, and a face that had forgotten how to arrange itself for company. Whatever she saw, she did not flinch from it. "My husband died 18 months ago in Carthage," she said. He was a dry goods merchant. He left debts and a good name and nothing in between. I sold what I could and I have $42 and a trunk of books and I need land. I'm not looking for charity and I'm not looking for rescue. I can cook, I can keep accounts, I can handle a team and I can work. If this is what you say it is, paper and labor and a fair share, then I'll marry you today. I nodded. It's what I say it is. Then let's not waste daylight. We married that afternoon in Duff's office. He served as witness, and the circuit judge, who happened to be in town for a cattle dispute, signed the paper. Nessa signed her name in a clear, upright hand. I signed mine. We shook hands in the doorway, the way two men close a fence deal, and I loaded her trunk into the wagon. The ride to the homestead took an hour and a half. She sat beside me on the bench and looked at the country, the open grass rolling out in every direction, the cottonwoods along the creek in their first pale green, the sky so wide it made the horizon look like a line drawn with a ruler. She did not make conversation. I appreciated that. Conversation on an open prairie feels like shouting into a church. When we came over the last rise and the homestead appeared below, the half-frame house with its soddy back wall, the forge shed, the corral, the wheat field stubbled and brown from the year's failure, she studied it the way she had studied me in the land office. Measuring, deciding. "The second room," she said. "I'll start it tomorrow. I'll sleep in the wagon tonight." "You don't have to." "I'll sleep in the wagon tonight, Mr. Harlow." I did not argue. I unhitched the team, carried her trunk to the porch, and went to the forge. I had 6 more shoes to finish for Cleve's outfit. The ring of hammer on iron carried a long way across the flat, and when I looked up between heats, I could see the lantern light in the wagon where she had made her bed among the sideboards, reading a book. That was the first night. It set the terms. I built the second room in 4 days. I had the lumber already. Cottonwood posts and boards I had been milling slowly through the winter, stacking them in the forge shed. I worked from first light until she called me for breakfast, then again until dark. She did not watch me build it. She spent those 4 days cleaning the house, scrubbing the plank floor I had laid in the fall, washing the single window with vinegar and newsprint, and rearranging the kitchen in ways I noticed and said nothing about. On the evening of the 4th day, I set the last hinge and hung the door and told her the room was ready. She walked through it. She touched the wall where I had planed the board smooth. She tested the bed frame I had built, cottonwood with rawhide lacing, not pretty but level. She opened and closed the door twice. "It's solid work," she said. "It's what I do." She moved in that night and closed the door between us, and the homestead settled into its new shape, 2 strangers under one roof, working the same land, eating at the same table, sleeping behind separate doors. I will tell you what I learned about Nessa Pardo in those first weeks, though I did not learn it in words. I learned it the way you learn the grain of a piece of wood, by working beside it. She rose before me. That surprised me, and then it stopped surprising me. By the time I came out of my room, the fire was lit, the coffee was on, and she was outside feeding the chickens she had insisted we buy from the Aunton Ranch on our second Saturday. She kept accounts. Every egg, every pound of flour, every nail I used, she wrote it in a ledger she had brought in her trunk in that clear, upright hand. I found this strange at first. Then I found it steadying. Someone was keeping track. Someone was making sure the numbers held. She could handle a team. She was not gentle about it, she was precise, the way a good farrier is precise, and the horses minded her. She drove the wagon to Breakyard alone on market days and came back with supplies and sometimes a newspaper, which she read aloud at supper whether I wanted her to or not. She read aloud at supper. That was the part I had not expected. She had 3 dozen books in that trunk, novels, histories, a volume of Emerson, an almanac, a veterinary manual she had bought for a dime at a church sale. After we ate, she would clear the plates and open whatever book she was reading and read a chapter or 2 into the silence, not asking if I wanted it, just reading. The first time she did it, I sat rigid in my chair and did not know where to look. The second time I leaned back. The third time I closed my eyes and listened to the shape of her voice, which was low and even and had a way of making the words land like they meant something. I did not tell her I could not read, not then. She planted a garden. She did not ask permission. She found a patch of ground on the south side of the house where the sun hit longest, and she broke it with a spade and planted beans and squash and onions and a row of sunflowers along the fence. I watched her work from the forge and said nothing. The sunflowers were not practical. I noticed them. We spoke at meals and sometimes in the evening and rarely during the day. The talk was about the homestead, what needed mending, what needed buying, when the next cattle outfit would come through and want horses shod. We did not speak about Carthage. We did not speak about Alma. We did not speak about what the marriage was or was not. The silence between us was not hostile. It was the silence of two people who had agreed on terms and intended to keep them, and it carried its own kind of trust. But a man notices things, even when he has decided not to. I noticed that she hummed when she worked in the garden, a tune I did not know, something without words, something that sounded like it came from a long way back. I noticed that she held her coffee cup with both hands, even when it was not cold. I noticed that on market days she bought a penny's worth of horehound candy and ate it in the wagon on the ride home, one piece at a time, as if it were the single luxury she allowed herself. I noticed that she never complained, not about the wind, which on the sage flat could strip paint from a board, and not about the heat, which in June came on like a forge fire and stayed until September. She endured the country the way the cottonwoods did, by bending and not breaking. And she noticed me. I felt it. I would be working at the forge and sense her gaze from the garden or the kitchen window, and when I looked up she would already be looking somewhere else. But the air between us would hold the impression of her attention, the way hot iron holds the ghost of the hammer's strike. I built the bookshelf in the third week. I did not plan it. I was in the forge finishing a set of hinges for Walcott's barn door, and I looked at the leftover cottonwood and thought of her books stacked on the floor in her room, and before I made a decision about it, my hands had already started cutting the joints. It was a simple thing, 4 shelves, pegged and sanded, with a brace at the back to hold it to the wall. I set it against the wall in the main room while she was in break yarn and said nothing about it. When she came home, she stopped in the doorway and looked at it, and then looked at me where I sat mending a halter by the stove. "You built that? Had the wood?" She touched the top shelf. She ran her fingers along the edge where I had planed it smooth. Then she went to her room and brought out her books, one armload at a time, and arranged them on the shelves. She did not say thank you. She did not need to. The books on the shelves said it for her, and after that the main room looked like a room where someone intended to stay. I did not think about what that meant. I told myself I did not think about it. In June, the weather turned. The heat came on thick and steady, the creek dropped to a trickle, and the grass on the flat went from green to gold to the color of a worn saddle. I shod horses through the worst of it, working in the forge shed before dawn and after dark to avoid the midday heat. Nessa kept the garden alive with creek water hauled in buckets, 2 trips a day, each one a quarter mile there and back, and she never asked me to carry them. I started carrying them anyway. I would find a reason to walk to the creek, checking the fence line, watering the team, and on the way back I would fill her buckets and leave them by the garden gate. She did not mention it. I did not mention it. The buckets appeared and the garden held, and neither of us said a word about the fact that I was watering her sunflowers. One evening in late June, she was reading aloud, a chapter from a novel about a sea captain, and she stopped mid-sentence and looked up at me. "You like the stories," she said. "I like the sound of them. But you don't read them yourself." I was quiet. She waited. Nessa had a way of waiting that was not impatient. It was the patience of someone who had learned that silence, given enough room, would fill itself. "I don't read," I said. She closed the book. She did not look surprised. She did not look pitying. She looked at me the way she had looked at the homestead on that first afternoon, measuring, deciding. Would you like to learn? I thought about it. I had lived 36 years without reading and managed well enough. I could shoe a horse, build a house, forge a hinge, judge the weather by the color of the sky and the behavior of the ants. I had never needed letters. But the books on the shelf looked like they belonged there, and her voice reading in the evening had become the part of the day I waited for without admitting I was waiting, and I understood in that moment that learning to read was not about the words on the page. It was about the woman holding the page. Yes, I said. She started the next evening. She used the almanac because the words were short and practical: rainfall, planting dates, weights and measures, and she sat beside me at the table with a pencil and wrote the letters on the margins. She was a patient teacher and an honest one. When I got a word wrong, she corrected me without softening it, and when I got one right, she nodded and moved on. She did not praise me like a child. She treated me like a man learning a skill, the way I would treat a boy learning to hold a hammer, direct, respectful, without fuss. I learned slowly. My hands, which could shape iron and plane cottonwood and set a nail in 3 strokes, were clumsy with a pencil. The letters would not go where I told them. But I came to the table every evening and she sat beside me, and the distance between us, which had been the width of a room, then the width of a table, then the width of a bench, shrank to the width of a book laid open between us, her finger tracing the line, my voice stumbling through the words. By July, I could read a full sentence from the almanac without stopping. She smiled when I read it, the first real smile I had seen from her. Not a polite smile or a careful one, but a smile that reached her eyes and changed the shape of her face. And I felt something move in my chest that I had not felt in 3 years, something I had assumed was dead and buried alongside Alma in the small grave on the rise behind the house. I did not name it. Naming it would make it real, and making it real would violate the terms: paper and labor and a fair share. That was the deal. I intended to keep it. July was when the chimney started drawing badly. The original chimney was sod and stone, built in my first year on the claim, and the mortar had crumbled through 2 winters and a summer's worth of heat. Smoke filled the house on still evenings, and Nessa coughed quietly into her sleeve and said nothing. And one morning I pulled the old chimney down and started building a new one. I built it from creek stone, flat slabs I hauled by wagon, fitted together with lime mortar I mixed in the forge. I built it wide and deep, with a proper firebox that would throw heat into the room and a flue that would draw clean. It took 12 days. Nessa brought me water and meals at the site, but did not comment on what I was doing or why. She understood, I think, that the chimney was not a conversation. It was a statement in the only language I was fluent in, the language of built things. When I lit the first fire in the new chimney on a cool July evening, the sage flat cooled at night even in summer. The smoke drew clean and straight, and the room filled with warmth instead of haze. And Nessa sat in the chair by the fire with her book and read aloud, and her voice did not catch on a cough. And I sat across from her, and listened and felt the heat on my face and the sound of her voice in my chest, and understood that I was building something I had not intended to build. The root cellar came next. I dug it in August, when the heat made above-ground work a punishment. 3 feet down the earth turned cool and damp, and I lined it with stone and built a door with a wooden latch, and told Nessa it was for storing the harvest, the beans and squash and onions she had coaxed out of the cracked prairie ground. "You didn't have to do that," she said, standing at the cellar door, looking at the shelves I had built inside. "You grew more than the kitchen will hold." She looked at me. I looked at the cellar. It was a good cellar, cool, dry, well-drained. It would keep vegetables through the winter. It was also, I knew, another sentence I could not say aloud, and she knew it too, because she touched the door frame the way she had touched the bookshelf with her fingertips, reading the grain, understanding what the wood meant that I could not. "Thank you, Judson," she said. It was the first time she had used my first name. That evening I sat at the table with the almanac and read a full page without help, and when I finished she put her hand on my arm, just for a moment, just her palm against my sleeve, and said, "You're ready for the novels." I was not ready for the novels, but I was ready for her to believe I was, and that was close enough. August was when the trouble came. A man named Dick Scallon had been running cattle on the open range north of the Sage Flat, and his herd had been drifting south onto my quarter section all summer. I had ridden out twice to push them back and fix the fence where they had broken through, and Scallon had sent word through his riders that he considered the Sage Flat open grass and did not recognize my claim. He came to the homestead on a Wednesday afternoon with 2 riders. They sat their horses at the fence line, and Scallon called me out. He was a heavy man with a sunburned face and the kind of voice that filled a room whether it needed filling or not. "Harlow," he said, "I've been patient. You've got a soddy and a wheat field that won't grow and a wife who showed up on a stage. The register isn't going to prove this claim, and you know it. Walk away now and I'll give you $50 for the improvements." I stood on the porch with my hands at my sides. Nessa was behind me in the doorway. I could feel her there the way you feel the heat from a forge, steady, present, not retreating. "The claim is filed," I said. "The improvements are mine, the wife is mine." I heard the word come out of my mouth, and I did not correct it. Nessa was quiet behind me. Scallon leaned on his saddle horn. "A paper wife and a broke-down forge. That's not a homestead, Harlow, that's a campsite." "Get off my land, Scallon." He sat there a moment longer, measuring me the way a man measures a fence post, deciding whether it will hold or whether it's worth pushing over. Then he turned his horse and rode north with his men, and I stood on the porch until the dust settled and my hand stopped shaking. "He'll be back," Nessa said from the doorway. "I know. What will you do?" "Finish the house, plant the wheat, prove the claim." She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "I can shoot." I turned and looked at her. She stood in the doorway with her arms crossed, her chin up, her brown eyes steady. "My husband was a poor businessman," she said, "but he was a decent shot and he taught me. I can handle a rifle." I had a Winchester over the door and a Colt in the forge. I took the Winchester down and handed it to her that evening, and she hefted it, checked the action, sighted along the barrel, and nodded. "It pulls left," she said. "A quarter inch at 50 yards. I'll remember that." We did not speak about Scallon again. We went back to work. The wheat field needed replanting, the fence needed strengthening, the forge had orders waiting. But something had shifted in the space between us, the way the grain shifts in a piece of wood when you cut across instead of along. We were not 2 strangers sharing a roof anymore. We were 2 people defending the same ground. The September storm came without warning. I had seen prairie storms before, the sky going green at the horizon, the wind dropping to nothing, and then the whole weight of the weather falling on you like a wall. This one came from the northwest on a Saturday evening. I was in the forge and Nessa was in the house, and the first crack of thunder broke so hard it spooked the horses out of the corral. I caught the horses in the rain, both of them, running blind across the flat, and led them back into the forge shed and tied them to the rail. The rain came horizontal and the wind tore boards off the corral fence, and I could hear them flying in the dark like something alive. I fought my way to the house and came through the door soaked and blown and found Nessa standing in the middle of the room with the Winchester in her hands, aimed at the front window. "It's me," I said. She lowered the rifle. "The window is cracking." I saw it, a long split running diagonally across the glass, the wind pressing against it like a hand trying to push through. If that window broke, the rain would flood the room and ruin everything: the books, the stove, the floor I had laid plank by plank. I grabbed a board from beside the stove, a piece of cottonwood I had been saving for a cabinet door, and held it against the window while the wind pushed back. Nessa was beside me. She braced the board from the bottom while I drove nails into the frame, working by feel in the near dark while the lightning turned the room white and the thunder shook the floor. We held that window for 2 hours. She did not let go. Her hands on the board were white-knuckled and steady, and she leaned into the wind with her shoulder against the wood and her feet braced on the floor. And when the worst of the storm passed and the wind dropped, she stayed where she was for another minute, breathing hard, her hair fallen loose around her face, her dress soaked. I realized I was standing close enough to feel the heat of her through the wet cloth. I stepped back. "Thank you," I said. She pushed her hair from her face. "You're welcome, Mr. Harlow." "Judson." She looked at me. The lantern had gone out and the only light was the last of the lightning, far to the east now, and in that unsteady flicker her face was drawn and tired and beautiful in a way I had not allowed myself to see until that moment. "Judson," she said, and then she went to her room and closed the door, and I stood in the dark by the boarded window and listened to the storm retreat across the prairie and knew that the terms had changed, and there was no paper in the world that could change them back. After the storm, I repaired the corral and replaced the window glass and replanted the wheat that the wind had flattened, and I did not talk about what had happened in the dark beside the window. Neither did she. We went back to our routine, the meals, the reading lessons. I was in the novels now, stumbling through a story about a man on a whaling ship, and Nessa corrected my pronunciation without mercy, and I loved her for it and did not say so. The garden, the forge, the accounts. But the silence between us was different now. It was not the silence of strangers keeping terms. It was the silence of two people who knew something and were choosing not to say it, and that kind of silence has a weight to it, a presence, like a third person sitting at the table. I built the garden fence in October. The deer had been getting into her squash and she had set out rags on sticks to scare them, which had worked for a week and then stopped working, because deer on the sage flat were not easily fooled. I cut cedar posts and strung wire and built a gate with a latch, and when I finished she walked the fence line, testing each post, and I watched her and thought about how 3 months ago I had built a room to put a wall between us, and now I was building a fence to keep the deer away from her sunflowers, and the direction of my building had changed without my deciding it. She looked up from the last post and caught me watching her, and I looked away, but not fast enough, and she knew. That night she read from the novel and I sat across from her and followed along in my own copy. She had bought a second one in Breakyard, insisting it was for the reading lessons, and we both knew it was so I could read beside her instead of being read to, and at the end of the chapter she said, without looking up, "Alma, tell me about her." I had not spoken Alma's name aloud in 3 years. I sat with it in my mouth for a long time, feeling the shape of it, the weight. "She was small," I said. "Smaller than you." She laughed easy. She couldn't cook worth a damn and she knew it, and she laughed about that too. She died in January and I buried her on the rise, and I haven't been able to look at that spot without feeling like someone took a chisel to my chest. Nessa closed the book. "Do you visit her?" "Every Sunday." "I know, I see you walk up there." I looked at my hands. "She would have liked you," I said, and I meant it, and it cost me something to say it, and Nessa heard the cost in my voice and did not try to make it cheaper with words. "Tell me something," she said, Nessa said, "something that was hers." I thought. She used to say that a good man is like a good chimney. He draws clean when the weather is worst. Nessa looked at the new chimney, drawing clean and steady in the October cold. She looked at me. "She was right," she said. That was all. She went to her room and I went to mine, and the door stayed closed. But the wall it was set in felt thinner than it had the night before. And I lay in the dark and listened to the wind on the sage flat and thought about chimneys and fences and bookshelves, and all the things a man builds when he cannot say what he means. November came in cold and hard. The creek froze at the edges. The wheat field, replanted after the storm, tended through the fall, stood in pale stubbled rows across the flat, dormant but alive, and the land office register was due in December for the proving. Scallon came back. This time he came alone in the early morning while I was at the forge. He rode up to the fence and sat his horse and called out to me. "Harlow, last offer. $100 for the improvements, and you and your paper wife can ride the stage back to wherever she came from." Nessa came out of the house. She had the Winchester. She held it across her body, not aimed, not threatening, but present. "My name is Nessa Harlow," she said. "I'm not going anywhere." Scallon looked at her. He looked at me. He looked at the house, the new chimney, the boarded window now reglazed, the cedar fence around the garden, the root cellar, the corral rebuilt and strengthened after the storm. He looked at the wheat field. "You're wasting your time," he said, but he said it like a man who was no longer sure. "Get off our land," I said. He rode north. He did not come back. I learned later from Duff that Scallon had filed a complaint with the Territorial Register and been told that the Harlow claim was in good standing and the improvements were substantial, and the Register intended to approve it in December. Nessa set the Winchester by the door and came to the forge and stood in the doorway and watched me work. I was making a hinge, a simple door hinge, nothing remarkable, and I felt her watching me bend the iron, and I knew that something needed to be said, and I did not know how to say it. "Nessa." "Yes." "You said your name was Harlow." "That's what it says on the paper." "Is that all it says?" She was quiet for a moment. The forge fire popped, and a shower of sparks drifted between us. "That depends," she said, "on who's reading it." She went back to the house. I finished the hinge. It was a good hinge, clean, strong, well-fitted. I did not know what to do with it. The Register came in the first week of December. His name was Wolford, a small man with ink-stained fingers and a leather case full of papers. He walked the fence lines, inspected the house, noted the improvements, counted the acres under cultivation, and asked to see our marriage certificate. Nessa produced it from her ledger, where she kept it pressed between the pages for August and September. Wolford read it, nodded, and wrote in his book. "Claim approved," he said. "Effective January 1st, the quarter section is yours free and clear. Congratulations." He shook my hand and climbed into his buggy and drove back to Breakyard, and Nessa and I stood on the porch and watched him go, and the sage flats spread out around us in every direction. 160 acres of cold brown grass under a December sky, and it was ours. I should have felt something large. Instead, I felt a coldness in my stomach, because the claim was proved and the paper arrangement had served its purpose, and there was no reason for her to stay. I did not say this. I went to the forge and worked. I shod 3 horses that afternoon for a trail outfit passing through, and when I came in for supper, Nessa had made biscuits and ham and coffee, and we ate in silence. And after supper, she read aloud from the novel. We were near the end now, the whaling ship in its last chase, and I listened and said nothing about the claim or the paper, or the fact that the arrangement was technically over and she could leave on the Thursday stage and take her $42, now $67. She had earned from selling eggs and vegetables at the Breakyard market all fall, and her trunk of books, and start over somewhere else. She finished the chapter and closed the book and sat with her hands in her lap. "The claim is proved," she said. "It is." "The terms are fulfilled." "They are." She waited. I said nothing. I had no words for this, no hammer, no chisel, no nail. The thing that needed building was made of something I did not know how to shape. "I have a room," she said quietly. "I have a shelf for my books and a garden with a fence and a chimney that draws clean. I have a root cellar full of squash. I have a table where a man is learning to read, and I have not been this useful or this steady since the day I buried my husband. You need to tell me, Judson, whether the door between us is a wall or just a door." I looked at the door to her room. It was a good door, cottonwood, plain, smooth, hung on iron hinges I had forged myself. I had built it to keep the terms. but terms change. A man builds a room and then a shelf, and then a chimney, and then a fence, and then a root cellar, and every built thing is a word he could not say. And at some point the words add up to a sentence, and the sentence says what the man cannot. "It's just a door," I said. She looked at me. I looked at her. The fire in the new chimney drew clean and the light was warm on her face, and the books on the shelf cast small shadows on the wall, and outside the wind moved across the sage flat the way it always moved, constant, endless, indifferent to what happened inside the walls that men built against it. "Then open it," she said. I did not open the door. I did something else. I said, "Come with me." I took the lantern and led her around the back of the house to the north wall, where a new section of framing stood in the cold December air. Posts and beams and joists, roofed but not yet walled, the skeleton of a room I had been building in secret for 6 weeks, working in the hours before dawn when she was still asleep. It was bigger than her current room. It had 2 windows, one facing east, toward the sunrise, and one facing south, toward the garden. I had built a bed frame from cedar, sanded until the grain was smooth enough to run silk over, and a writing desk with a drawer that locked, and another set of bookshelves, wider and deeper than the ones in the main room, with room for twice the books she owned and the ones she had not yet bought. She stood in the doorway with the lantern light moving over the unfinished walls and the cedar bed and the writing desk and the shelves, and she did not speak. She put one hand on the door frame, the way she had touched the bookshelf, the way she had touched the chimney, reading the grain, reading the words I had built into the wood, and I saw her shoulders shake once, and I understood that she was not crying from sadness. She was crying because the room was the longest sentence I had ever spoken, and she had understood every word of it. "I started it in October," I said. "I didn't know what I was building at first, then I did." She turned to me. Her face was wet and her eyes were steady, and she said, "Judson Harlow, I did not come here to fall in love with a man who speaks in fence posts and chimney stone. But you built a home around me so quietly I didn't notice it was happening until I was already inside it." "I didn't notice either," I said, "not until I was building a room I couldn't explain." She stepped toward me. I stood still. She put her hand on my chest over the pocket of my coat, and I felt the weight of it, 5 fingers, a palm, the warmth of a living woman who had chosen to stay. "It's not a paper marriage anymore," she said. "It hasn't been for a while." "Then stop calling me Mrs. Harlow like I'm a guest in my own house." "What should I call you?" "Nessa. The way you say it when you think I can't hear." I did not know I said her name when I thought she could not hear. But apparently I did, the way a man will say a word to himself to learn its shape, the way I had sounded out the words in the almanac, tracing the letters with my finger, learning the language of something new and necessary. "Nessa," I said. "That's better." We married again on Christmas Day. Not because we had to, the paper from April still held and the claim was proved, but because we wanted to. Duff Jessamine served as witness again. The circuit judge was wintering in Helena, so the breakyard preacher did the service, a short man named Overton with a booming voice and a genuine fondness for homesteaders. Nessa wore her blue dress, cleaned and pressed, and I wore my good coat, the one I had not taken from the cedar chest since Alma's funeral. Nessa noticed the coat. She touched the lapel and said nothing, and I knew she understood what it meant that I had taken it out, and that understanding was the gift. I finished the new room in January. I walled it, plastered the joins, fitted the windows with glass I had ordered from Breakyard, and hung a proper door, cottonwood, plain smooth, with iron hinges I had forged and a wooden latch that lifted from either side. I did not put a lock on it. There was nothing between us that needed locking. She moved her books to the new shelves and her dresses to the pegboard I had built and her ledger to the writing desk. And on the first night in the new room she read aloud to me from the beginning of a new novel, a story about a girl on an island, and I lay beside her and listened, and followed the words on the page in my own copy and read along, silently, one word at a time, building sentences out of letters the way I built fences out of posts. And outside the wind blew across the sage flat, and the chimney drew clean and the wheat field slept under the January snow, waiting for spring. In February she told me she was carrying a child. I was at the forge. She came to the doorway and stood there the way she had stood on that first day at the land office in Breakyard, measuring, deciding, her hands clasped in front of her. But her eyes were different now. There was something in them that had not been there before, not uncertainty but wonder, the kind of wonder a person feels when they have been living in a house and suddenly realize it has more rooms than they knew. "Judson," she said, "I have something to tell you." I set down the hammer, I looked at her, she told me. I do not have the words for what I felt. I have never had the words for the things that matter most. But I will tell you what I did. I walked to her and I took her hands in mine, my hands that were black with soot and rough with calluses, and had never been good for anything finer than iron and wood. And I held them, and she held mine, and we stood in the forge doorway with the fire at my back and the winter sunlight on her face, and I understood that the homestead was proved, and the paper marriage was proved, and the thing I had built without knowing I was building, it was the only improvement that mattered. That was 43 years ago. I am 79 now. The quarter section on the Sage Flat is 480 acres. We bought the adjacent sections as they came available, and our son Lemuel runs the cattle, and our daughter Claire teaches at the schoolhouse in Breakyard, and Nessa's granddaughter is named Alma, because Nessa chose the name herself, and I did not have to ask her why. The bookshelf is still against the wall in the main room. The chimney still draws clean. The garden fence has been rebuilt 3 times. I replaced the posts each time, cedar for cedar, and Nessa still grows sunflowers along the south side, and they are still not practical, and I still notice them. She reads aloud to me in the evenings. I can read on my own now, have been able to for 40 years, but I still prefer her voice. I have never told her this. I suspect she knows. There is very little about me that Nessa Harlow does not know, including the things I have never said, because she learned long ago to read the grain of me the way she reads the grain of the wood I build for her, with her fingertips patiently, understanding that the words are in the work, and the work is the love, and the love was never on the paper. It was in the fence posts, and the chimney stone, and the cedar shelves, and the room with the east-facing window, and it is there still.